Dear friends, welcome to this reader, B'Sharayich Yerushalayim, in your gates, Jerusalem, put together both by the Hartman Institute and the Foreign Ministry of Israel. Our goal is to enable during this high holiday cycle to have a conversation about Jerusalem. To have a conversation about what Jerusalem means. What can it mean? What should it mean? To have a loving, thoughtful, and if necessary, critical reflection on how Jerusalem as a unified city now is shaping our thoughts, shaping our aspirations, shaping our challenges and responsibilities. There's so much conversation about Israel 50 years after 67, which goes to the immediate political. And very often we forget that part of the consequences of 67 was a change in the way we do Jewish, change in the experiences that are available for us, sometimes both for the good and for the bad. And using Jerusalem as a trigger, how do we, through the gates of Jerusalem, think about the complexity of this city, and through that, some of the complexities of what it means to be a Jew, some of the complexities of modern Israel. Jerusalem is a unique city, but it's a microcosm of a larger agenda and larger questions. And that's what we hope to present for you. How are you going to use this? That's up to you. There's many options, and I'd like to suggest a few. One, you could print this out and put it in the machzor. You can use some of the sources, and during a sermon, during one of the many high holiday speeches, you can come back to it once or twice. You could stop and say, let's just reflect on something, and use. You're not going to use all. The purpose of the variety here is for you to be able to glean those you want. You can use it in a class beforehand, in an adult education, in an evening. You can use it during Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There are so many places where our community could come together, not around politics, but around reflecting on Jerusalem, something which is so embedded in politics, but also has to transcend it. Having a relationship with Israel is not always about agreeing, but it's about finding within Israel meaning. And finding within Israel meaning is also not always about agreeing, but it's about reflecting on your aspirations, having a space to think, having a space to talk. And it's our prayer that Jerusalem could be that place. The city that is so divided politically could maybe be a city that we could unite by thinking about her and by learning about her. That's our goal. As we thought about the sources in Jerusalem, or some of the complexities of Jerusalem, we chose to focus on three of what are multiple meanings and values and considerations when it comes to Jerusalem. And the three we chose are the Jerusalem of prayer. The second is the Jerusalem of brothers and sisters, in essence, peoplehood. And the third is the Jerusalem of hope and longing. And I'm going to briefly walk with you through the sources so that you can understand why we put them there. My emphasis is going to be on what I feel is the major point in each source. But not only are you going to pick between sources, you're also going to pick your interpretation and what you'd like to emphasize. But I hope this leader's guide will empower you, enable you to use these sources, whether it's in sermon or whether it's in a class. Elevate our conversation and use Jerusalem to elevate it. So let's begin. The first section is Jerusalem of prayer. And 5 different sources. The first is a narrative of Abba Kovner, about who he was, who he is as a Jew, and his first experience of being at the Kotel. Abba Kovner defines himself, I'm a believer. I'm not necessarily Orthodox, I'm a believer. And he comes to the Kotel and he feels he doesn't belong there. The experience of coming to the walk, what am I supposed to do? What is this Kotel supposed to do for me? And how am I supposed to find myself there? There's no instruction on how the Kotel is supposed to touch you. And then he says, I said the Mincha prayer and arrived. Jerusalem, before we get to its politics and to its challenges, Jerusalem is the Jerusalem of prayer. Jerusalem is the place where you arrive when you pray. Jerusalem is the place where the spiritual dimension of of our faith is concentrated, is directed. It's not a heavenly Jerusalem. The earthly Jerusalem is the Jerusalem of prayer. In the Jerusalem of prayer, in many ways, the heavenly and the earthly Jerusalem are collapsed. They're the same. It's here where we find ourselves through the spiritual and religious dimension so central to our tradition. This is what Solomon understands when he builds the temple in this absolutely remarkable text, and it's remarkable both for its context and for its time. Solomon just finishes building the temple. His father's dream. Now building a house for God with all of its tapestry, hugely complex, complicated process. And then what does he say? But will God really dwell on earth? Does the Jerusalem of prayer assume that God is here? Is that why we pray in Jerusalem? Why is prayer and spirituality so connected? Why when I say prayer, do you arrive? Is it because you're now speaking with God? Solomon says, I've just built the temple, but will God really dwell on earth? The heaven and their uttermost reaches cannot continue. Solomon understands that monotheism is about a God who transcends space. God can't be limited to space. So then, what's the whole enterprise? What is this notion of holy space in the Jewish tradition? And Jerusalem challenges us to ask ourselves, what is our notion of holy space? Solomon says, holy space is not a place that God resides in, because that's idolatrous. Holy space is not literally God's space. Holy space is figurative space. Because you don't really live here. For the heavens and under those reaches cannot continue. How much less this house that I just built this house, but I know it's not where you're going to live. You're in the heaven. You're everywhere. You're not here. There's nothing so uniquely holy about Jerusalem. What a remarkable Jewish statement about the meaning of holy space. And use a conversation about Jerusalem and the Jerusalem of prayer to talk about the meaning of holy space. And Solomon creates a functional notion. Jerusalem is not where God is. Jerusalem is where we become empowered to pray, because we believe that if we pray here, God will listen. We feel empowered to overcome the infinite gap between the human being and God. How do I know my words are heard? So holy space is not a place where God is. It's a place where we are able to give birth to our spiritual longings. And that's what Jerusalem means. It's not holier than Tel Aviv or holier than New York or Toronto. God's everywhere. It's not here. But from when the temple was built, now close to 3,000 years, this is the place that activates our belief that God listens. And Solomon prays to God and says, the Jewish people, they're going to pray to this wall, to this space. Wherever you are, listen. That's holy space. Holy space is where God and the Jewish people meet conceptually, not physically. And that this is close to 3,000-year-old text has this sophistication about monotheism and holy space is just truly remarkable. But like everything in our tradition, it's also debated. For many, Jerusalem is a holy space because it's literally where God lives. It's not no figurative implied here. And notice the two different versions of the Shmoneh Esrei, the Amidah prayer, on U'Yerushalayim Ircha, the section on Jerusalem. In the traditional version, the one in all Orthodox prayer books and in many conservative and many traditional Sfaradi, all Sfaradi, U'Yerushalayim Ircha Berachamim Tashuv. To Jerusalem, your city, may you return. Return with mercy. V'tishkon betocha, and dwell in its midst as you have spoken. Jerusalem of prayers where God lives. How does that work out within a monotheistic discourse? Doesn't matter. You don't have. One of the interpretations of Jerusalem is this is where God lives. And that's also why Jews, Christians, and Muslims fought. We didn't really fight, we were defeated. But Christians and Muslims fought over this for so long. And now that we have it again, you imagine what the intoxication of the fantasy of being in control of God's space. If you control God's space, you're the authentic one. You're the power of controlling God's space and the so-called legitimacy and victory that it implies. Yerushalayim Recha Barachamim Tashuv. Come back, literally. In many liberal versions, Yerushalayim Recha Barachamim Tifneh. And it's, you don't return because you don't have a physical space. And this liberal prayer is in many ways a reflection, is far more traditional. This is Solomon's prayer, literally. Turn to Jerusalem. And V'yesh shalom b'shareh, may there be peace in her gates, not may you dwell in its midst. And what is the Jerusalem of prayer? And the opportunity to speak about the idea of the intensity of the holiness of Jerusalem. And what does a holy city mean? Both through Kings and the two versions of Amidah is a very significant an important point to be made, which also has great political consequences about now that we're the masters of Jerusalem, what is the city that we believe we're the masters of? Are we the masters of Solomon's city, or are we the masters of God's city? It makes a very big difference. Amichai is a beautiful text because it shows how the Jerusalem of prayer isn't just access through Mincha and the Kotel. It's Jerusalem of prayer also has a profound impacts on a secular prayer as well. And playing off the imagery of Yom Kippur in the opening and the Ilah in the closing of the gates at the end. He does a pilgrimage to Jerusalem just like everyone else, but he doesn't go to the Kotel. Everyone else goes to the Kotel. He, as the day progresses, he goes though to Jerusalem to pray. And he meets, his prayer is not a conversation with God, but it's a conversation with a Jerusalem Arab. And he talks about his past, talks about what happened to him, talks about the memories that he has of Jerusalem. He tells Jerusalem, his prayer is his story. And he wants to share his story with the other, who in many ways now our stories are incompatible. There is no room for them. I explained to him in my heart about all the decades and the causes and the events, why I'm now here. My father's shop was burned. He's buried there. And when I finished telling my story, and most prayers are in dialogue. Prayer is you're talking. And Amichai talks. And Jerusalem connects him to his past, which is a deep part of that's his Jewishness. And when he finishes, it was time for the closing of the gates of prayer. It's Ni'ilah. Now at the Kotel and in the synagogues, everybody now turns to God and asks for forgiveness. But he, the shopkeeper, locks his gate, and I returned, and he returns home. Jerusalem as an inspiration for a prayer in which you connect to your, not to God, but to your past, is a beautiful, beautiful part of Yehuda Amichai, or what Yehuda Amichai puts before us. And so, take the Jerusalem of prayer, elevate it, and share it with your community. The Jerusalem of brothers and sisters is another dimension of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a place where we don't just meet God. Jerusalem is a place where we meet each other. Jerusalem is a place where our national collective identity as a shared space for all Jews is solidified. Jerusalem is not where we meet God. Jerusalem is where we become a people. It's Jerusalem as a capital. Jerusalem, it's not Jerusalem as holy, Jerusalem as capital. And Jerusalem as capital is the Jerusalem that everybody has to belong in. And one of the great challenges is what happens when the Jerusalem of prayer and the Jerusalem of capital, the Jerusalem of brothers and sisters conflict. Because the Jerusalem of prayer, I want to meet their God, and the Jerusalem of peace says, this is a place where all Jews have to be at home. And we start with the beautiful text from Mishnah Avot, the idea that no one ever says, I have no space in Jerusalem. Now, how many people come to Jerusalem? I don't have any place to be there. Now, physically, of course, you could have no place. If you're squished in and everybody's tic-tac, why would Jerusalem be in a place? What happens is Jerusalem is a place that when you come to, you have to contract yourself. Jerusalem isn't a place where you push yourself on. Jerusalem requires that contracting. Maybe that's part of the Jerusalem of prayer. Maybe when you're in a holy place, it's not all about you, stupid. It's a contract. This is not a place for your act. This is not you. This is a place where you do something. So contract yourself. And when you contract yourself, other people have space. Jerusalem could be the place where Jews could meet. And Jerusalem has to be the place where no one feels I'm being pushed out. And one of the great challenges, how do we live that Jerusalem? Bambi Sheleg, in her beautiful accounting of Jerusalem, speaks of the Jerusalem of brothers, of the complexity, the variety, the cacophony of peoples and identities. There's no city which has that much variety, both within Judaism and outside of Judaism. And her notion of the great potential of Jerusalem, embedded not in its theological, but precisely in its profound diversity. And Jerusalem of brothers and sisters, that's where we all are. We're all there. The whole story is there. There's every Beit Midrash in the world is there. And now how do we live? And as she says, Jerusalem is the city which challenges us not to ask who we are, but who do we want to be? And whether we could fully embody the challenge of the Jerusalem of brothers and sisters. The Jerusalem of prayer and the Jerusalem of brothers and sisters meet in the Tosefta and in the Sigd prayer. Those standing outside of the land direct their hearts to the land. Those standing in the land direct their hearts to Jerusalem. Those standing in the north direct themselves to the south. Standing in the south face the north. East face the west. West face the east. So it will be that all the Jewish people will be praying to one place. Jerusalem is where it's not where our prayers meet God. It's where our prayers meet other people's prayers. It's where we see each other. It's where we become a people, because all of our prayers, just like Bambi Shelley, this is where we're all there. And do we allow it? Or does the Jerusalem of prayer become a place where I want to say only I could pray and you have no place? How do we fulfill this responsibility? Where precisely because Jerusalem is a city of a prayer, it becomes too cramped. because I want to dominate whose prayer is authentic, who's allowed to pray, how they're allowed to pray, where they're allowed to pray. The idea that we come together. We don't pray the same prayers, but all our prayers have to go through Jerusalem, so all of us have to have a place to pray in Jerusalem. The Sigd prayer we brought is it's a midrash built on the Tosefta, and it's so remarkable because Ethiopian Jewry ostensibly left before the oral tradition. And the Tosefta is the oral tradition. But this oral tradition enters into Sigd prayer. And as they celebrate the Jerusalem, everybody bows down, they'll come to the east and worship in Jerusalem. This core idea of Jerusalem, of brothers and sisters, is so powerfully expressed. Jerusalem it's not yours. Jerusalem is all of ours, is a beautiful expression of this idea. And finally, Avigdor Hameiri, in his beautiful poem, says to us, what have we done? What have we done to Jerusalem? I want to celebrate Jerusalem. I want to be worthy of this city that we've now returned to. But how can I build your temple when there's no peace amongst your children? Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Ethiopian, Yemenite, Russian, Haredi, secular. The cacophony that Bambi Sheleg celebrates, Avigdor says, I know it's all here, but are we making Jerusalem too cramped? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, this is not what I dreamt about. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, make peace amongst your sons. How do we fight and build the Jerusalem that defines its essence, the Jerusalem of brothers and sisters? What is its potential and how do we actualize it? And the third dimension, which is so central to this city, is the Jerusalem of hope and longing. Jerusalem was the way we expressed our hopes. When we dreamt about the world as it should be, it was about doing so in Jerusalem. Just like when Jerusalem was destroyed, we use Jerusalem's destruction as the model for what happens when a society loses its core validity and its strength. Jerusalem is destroyed through senseless hatred. Jerusalem becomes also the ideal. Next year in Jerusalem is not merely a physical, it's next year in a different life. So Jerusalem's power is not simply because that's where we pray. It's not just simply where we meet each other. Jerusalem is the embodiment of who we want to be. And now the question is, who do we want to be? And now that we've returned to Jerusalem, are our visions high enough? Are our dreams high enough? There's a particular dream and a universal dream of Jerusalem. Psalm 137 is a very particular dream. I'm never forget you, Jerusalem, because now being outside of Jerusalem is the exile of the Jewish people. It's their humiliation. Exile is where our captives say, sing us a song of Zion. God, amuse me. And we can't sing. The Jewish people yearn to sing again. But what we're yearning for is freedom and independence. And Jerusalem will always be the carrier of that aspiration for the redemption of Jews, for creating a space where Jews could be safe. So central to the Zionist story. But Al Naharot Bavel, when you're outside of Jerusalem, when you don't own Jerusalem, you're humiliated. You're at the hands of your captors. We never forget Jerusalem because we never forget our aspiration to become redeemed again. But what we're looking for is our redemption. It's like, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, it's almost, if I forget thee, my Jerusalem. We have to remember it because it's ours and it's the carrier of our aspiration for redemption. But opposite 137, Psalm 137 is Isaiah 2. And Isaiah says Jerusalem is not just the carrier of the Jewish aspiration for exile, degradation, humiliation, and danger coming to an end. It's also when world history, when the order of the universe is going to change. There's a new Torah coming out of Zion. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. When people take it out of the context of Isaiah, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah is not the Torah of Sinai. Torah of Sinai came out of Sinai. From Zion, it's a new Torah. It's a Torah which doesn't apply. It's not Judaism. According to Isaiah, let's go up to the mount. God's going to instruct us in his ways that we may walk in his paths. For instruction shall come out, and what's going to be? He will judge amongst the nations. They will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation, shall never again no war. We're not teaching them Shabbos and Kashrus. Jerusalem, the Torah of Jerusalem, is a Torah in which people meet people of all faiths. And under a one monotheistic world, we begin to engage each other, see each other, and ultimately cease the incessant conflict and war that has embraced all of us since the beginning. We got monotheism wrong. Monotheism becomes that which causes us to fight with each other. And Isaiah says, Jerusalem was a place where everybody comes up. Now it's still the house of the God of Jacob. It's still ours. But at the same time, it's the mountain of the Lord. It's not where God necessarily lives. By being the mountain of the Lord, it becomes something that none of us are sovereign over, and therefore our aspirations for Jerusalem can never just be our particularist nationalist salvation, but it's a universalist redefining of a new order in the world. And do we still hope for that? Jerusalem has to be, as the city of God, pushes you further than just what's good for the Jews. And how do we balance 137 and Isaiah 2 is one of the greatest challenges of contemporary Israel. And by studying this, you're opening up that story. Go back to Moshe Dayan. The minute we capture it, he says we Jews who have returned to Jerusalem aren't going to be like the Muslims and the Christians before us. We did not come to Jerusalem to conquer the holy places of others. The whole history of Jerusalem is to come to Jerusalem to conquer the holy places of the others, and more significantly, to wipe them out, so that if yours alone stands, you have won. And in many ways, Moshe Dayan is echoing Isaiah 2. I've come back, but I'm not, Jerusalem has a place where all of us could live. That's the aspiration. Naim Aredi says, it's not working so well. Jerusalem cracks apart. There's the mosque and the church and the synagogue. Worshippers of the dome of the rock hear the whisperings of the notes. It's your prayer. It's like when we talked about Jews meeting each other here, it's like my prayers are they're cracking into your space. It's like a zero infiltrating the cracks of the wall. There's the Via Dolorosa, many crosses. They're all here. But they're not living here in a universalist sharing in the house on the mountain of God. And he says, in a remarkable analogy, is God going to do to Jerusalem what he did to Babel? The crime. The crime of Babel is that there was complete, look at the brilliance of this. The crime of the Tower of Babel is that there was no disagreement and no room for disagreement. The crime of Jerusalem is that there's no ability to join together anymore. And the crime and punishment is God going to break Jerusalem like he breaks Babel? And because they're both the opposites of the danger of the world that human beings could create. And then we end with a beautiful text by Heschel and by Tamara Ladd-Applebaum, where Heschel sees Jerusalem and very deep, the echo of eternity. Jerusalem is a witness, an echo of eternity. And it is precisely because it is a witness and an echo of eternity. Jerusalem is more than just its physical. Jerusalem is a different city. There isn't the Jerusalem of earth and a Jerusalem of heaven. Jerusalem of earth is the Jerusalem of heaven. There's something different coming here. And because of that, we recognize that Jerusalem has stopped in the middle of her speech. What a profound articulation. Let Jerusalem speak again. To our people and to all people. Let it be both the place for our particular aspirations and be a place that we share with the rest of the world. This is a city never indifferent to the sky, he says. This is a city where spirituality engulfs, where the experience of the eternal is normal. So let that speak, and through that come to a larger universal hope for what our world should be. And as Tamar Elad Applebaum says so beautifully in her midrash on Shir HaMa'alot, Hayinu Kecholmim, we were like dreamers. She says that's not a description. That's a mitzvah. That's an obligation, commandment. We have returned to Zion, she says, to be those that dream, and not those that have ceased to dream and become mere survivors. And now dream, she says, to build a huge Beit Midrash for all cultures, echoing the voice of Isaiah. What do we hope for? Very often we argue about politics, but the divide is often about what is it that you hope. And if you're hoping for the wrong thing, you're going to shape not merely our messianic period, but you're going to shape what our life is here. Hopes about the future are rarely about the future. They are political programs for the present. And Jerusalem of hope and longing puts before us the responsibility of embracing Jerusalem as that which reminds us of the best, what we are. It's how the echo of the eternal has to push us to never allow that which is to define us. And to always, as Tamar says, to embody that to be in Jerusalem is to take upon yourself your responsibility to dream. Jerusalem of prayer, brothers and sisters, hope and longing, pick whichever one. Pick a piece from each one. Let's talk. Let's talk about Israel. Let's talk about Jerusalem. Let's learn. Let's experience. And let's enrich our high holiday religious experience through engaging with the eternal city. Thank you.